Unit 6, Absolutism versus Constitutionalism. Charles XII of Sweden. There are not many kings as polarizing as Charles XII when it comes to historians. Regardless, it is hard to find as many brilliant military commanders as Charles XII. Charles was completely absorbed as a child in shooting and war games. He was brilliant at mathematics and worked out tactical military problems in the schoolroom. As an adolescent, he amused himself in wintertime by jumping from ice floe to ice floe on horseback. Being that he assumed the crown at such an early age, he really never lost that childish sense of invincibility. This proves to be both beneficial and detrimental in later battles, in that Charles insisted that he lead direct charges into the enemy's lines, and his penchant for walking out into the middle of the firing lines and waving at the enemy. Shortly after taking the crown, he developed a Spartan-like puritanical habits. Scorning the drunken orgies of monarchs like Peter the Great or Augustus II, he gave up alcohol. He refused to wear the great curly wigs requisite for gentlemen in the area and dressed in a plain blue uniform with brass buttons. He showed no interest in girls or court ceremony or in civil administration. His sole delight was war. Thus, in 1700, Charles eagerly took the field with the Swedish army, never returning to Stockholm during the remaining 18 years of his reign. Charles first invaded Denmark in April of 1700, and by August, the Swedes closed in on Copenhagen. The Danes hurriedly made peace. 3 months later, in November of 1700, Charles XII and the Swedes had made the 1,000-plus-mile march across Estonia with 11,000 men to relieve the town of Narva on the Gulf of Finland, besieged by 40,000 Russians. Peter the Great, suspecting that a 4-to-1 advantage was still not enough for his untrained serf army, abruptly quit the Russian camp. In a driving snowstorm, the Swedes attacked Peter's soldiers and almost immediately surrendered in droves. The Battle of Narva convinced Charles that the Russians did not know how to fight and could be beaten at any time. So he turned then to deal with Augustus of Saxony and Poland. In 1701, he defeated Augustus' Saxon army at the Daugava River and crossed into Poland, demanding the Polish Śladza depose Augustus. For the next 6 years, he mired himself in Polish politics. Outside of war, Charles was a very trusting man, especially of royals and nobility. He could find Lithuanian allies who wanted to be free of Polish rule, and Polish allies who wanted a weaker king than Augustus. But most Poles hated the Swedish intruders who plundered their territory. The Swedish army, up to 1707, chased around Saxon, Polish, and Russian contingents around the Polish countryside and occupied each of the chief Polish towns in turn, without ever gaining meaningful control. In 1704, at Warsaw, a gathering of Śladza attended by Swedish soldiers were persuaded to elect by voice Charles's nominee, Stanislas Leszczynski, as the new king of Poland. In 1706, when Charles moved his army into Saxony, Augustus signed a humiliating treaty which acknowledged his dethronement in Poland and was forced to personally recognize King Stanislas. Still, nothing at last had been accomplished. The Polish regime was a puppet state dependent on Swedish military force. The war could have been over much earlier. However, Charles was under the belief that since he did not start the war, he would not quit until total victory was established over his foes. With Denmark humiliated and Poland somewhat in his hands, all he had left to deal with was Peter the Great and the terrible Russian army. During the years Charles had spent in Poland, Peter was busy as well. Viewing the disgrace at Narva in 1700 as a necessary lesson, he reorganized the Russian army and sent his troops back to fight the Swedish garrisons along the Baltic. Between 1702 and 4, while Charles was chasing Augustus, the Russians captured most of the Swedish forts, including Narva, along the coast of the Gulf of Finland. These campaigns gave Peter's soldiers much-needed self-confidence and battle experience. 1703, with the construction of St. Petersburg, the Tsar started to send Russian navy out to the Baltic and welcomed the first Western merchant ships onto its new port. He was very eager for peace here with Sweden, as long as Charles would leave him in St. Petersburg. Naturally, Charles XII saw no victory in any concessions, especially to a Russian. Charles XII marched east towards the Russian border with over 40,000 men, the largest and finest he had ever assembled. It's hard to imagine why he expected to conquer such a vast state as Russia when he couldn't completely master Poland. The answer appears to be that he didn't want to conquer Russia. He simply wanted to destroy the Russian army and capture Peter himself. An overwhelming victory might generate a new Russian Tsar that he may suggest for Moscow, as he did with Stanislaus in Poland. Charles then makes the weird decision to attack Moscow at first instead of St. Petersburg. He should have struck first at St. Petersburg and, if necessary, then moved towards Moscow, thus keeping his open communication lines for supplies and reinforcements from the Baltic. Unlike Western commanders who stopped campaigning during the winter, Charles, who seemed impervious to pain or the elements, moved his troops in a bitter winter. In February 1708, he almost caught Peter in Lithuania. Thereafter, nothing went well. Also, this starts the disastrous historical decision to invade Russia. Peter stayed always just out of reach, systematically harassing the Swedes with guerrilla warfare and raids. Plus, Peter utilized the scorched earth tactic, ruthlessly laying waste to surrounding territory by fire, keeping the Swedes perpetually short of food. Charles spent the summer of 1708 near Smolensk, waiting on supplies from the Baltic, which never came due to the Russian Navy cutting them off. Now too weak for a direct assault on Moscow, he turned south and joined forces with the Ukraine and rebel Cossack chieftain Ivan Mazepa. Charles gained supplies and reinforcements, but he was now more dangerously isolated than ever. In the catastrophic winter of 1709, thousands of Swedes froze to death. By May of 1709, Charles's army was reduced to 20,000. In May, Charles strikes at the town of Poltava. Peter closed in on him with an army of 40,000, and in late June, Charles received a bullet wound in his foot. He was sidelined due to a fever infection and could only be moved by stretcher. Still, he refused to retreat. On July 8, the Swedes attacked Peter's encampment. Although they had no artillery, the Russians outmanned, outshot, and outfought them, and quickly turned the Battle of Poltava into a decisive victory. The Swedes fled south to the Crimea, leaving nearly 10,000 dead or captured. Charles's disastrous invasion of Russia had ominous parallels to the failures of Napoleon in 1812 and Adolf Hitler in 1941 through 43. Charles, still injured, only considered Poltava to be a minor setback and was carried refuge to the Ottoman Empire by a small guard. His remaining troops on the Dnieper River outside of Kiev surrendered to Peter. Between 1709 and 13, all of Charles XII's military gains were wiped out. Augustus reoccupied the Polish throne while Stanislaus fled to exile. Hanover and Prussia joined the assault upon Sweden and, together with Denmark, took over almost all the Swedish holdings on the South Baltic coast. Russia captured the territories bordering the eastern Baltic from Riga to Helsingfors, and Charles XII stubbornly, some would say blindly, refused to accept these losses. From 1709 to 14, he stayed in Turkey trying to organize campaigns against Russia and Poland. He then traveled incognito wearing a wig and mustache through Austria and Germany to his remaining territory in the Baltic, Swedish Pomerania. In 1715, he resumed a campaign against Saxony and Denmark, but this time with a new enemy in Prussia. In 1718, on the precipice of invasion of Norway, then under the Danish rule, he was killed by an enemy shot, or perhaps murdered by one of his own soldiers.